I have a humble gender hypothesis to present. People note that there seems to be a trend of people, especially men, eschewing gender norms and becoming non-binary, or at least non-masculine. But before you attack the SJWs over this, hear me out. I think maybe the problem might be toxic masculinity.
Just to make sure there's no misunderstanding, I want to make something absolutely clear. This term is not a condemnation of men or manhood, because again, toxic masculinity only refers to a particular set of harmful actions and cultural practices, and none of those behaviors are inherent or biological traits of men.
And I think that it has a lot to do with the growing number of people who identify as non-binary, gender non-conforming, genderqueer, what have you.
Transgender queer.
That's not a thing. Imagine being assigned male at birth. From the age of 4 or 5, you're called a sissy, a pansy, a pussy, a soy boy, a cuck. You're told you'll never be a man. And you're often derided for not being masculine enough. Maybe you're non-binary, or maybe even transgender at heart, and maybe they're picking up on it from the start. Or maybe boys are just dicks sometimes.
Boys being boys, boys being boys.
Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys.
Some people who undergo this constant gender speculation that happens among the biologically male and say to themselves, fuck this. I'm going to do what I want. At this point, some of them may play with cross-dressing and being a woman in a limited capacity. And some of them may enjoy this and even become women full-time. But some may just become uncomfortable with the label of maleness and the toxic behaviors they see some males exhibiting in the name of maleness and say, fuck gender entirely. If that's what it takes to be a man, I just don't really want to be one. At least, that's in part what happened to me. I don't identify as male even though I don't really try to be female because I don't want all of those negative male traits associated with me. And while I recognize that toxic masculinity and masculinity are two different things, frankly, I just prefer not having to fill a gender role. It's freeing. It allows me to embody the best parts of humanity as a whole, at least in theory. I should explain that toxic masculinity is a phrase invented by the men's movement writers to refer to the social pressures placed upon men to be violent, competitive, independent, and unfeeling as a toxic form of masculinity, in contrast to a real or deep masculinity that they say men have lost touch with in modern society. Personally, I still play right into the social isolation that these authors describe, so I guess I still have a ways to go. Male culture often others members that don't perform their gender in toxic and exaggerated ways, especially as children and young adults. After being othered for that first 20 years of your life, you may still not choose to live life as a female. But it's completely understandable if you choose to live a life that isn't entirely male either. This damaging culture could also be reflected in suicide rates as well, which concerned the men's movement writers who coined the phrase, even then. For some unknown reason in the United States since about 2007, suicide numbers have been increasing for both sexes, with male suicide increasing about 3.9% and women's suicide rates increasing by 1.3%, as the ratio between male and female suicide rates begins to move from 4-to-1 to 3-to-1. Could this be in part because of the attitudes of toxic masculinity sinking into their heads?
But what happens when those nasty untrue things get inside your head and you start telling them to yourself? You've probably seen the film Inception, where they go into a guy's dreams and plant an idea. It's like that. Somebody puts a thought in your head and it grows. So it is kind of you, but it also kind of came from outside, like a colonization of the mind. A while ago, I made a video about a philosopher called Simon Critchley, who has this idea called split mind theory. The idea is that the human mind is split into two bits, the bit that we experience, and then the little voice that's always correcting and judging and looking over your shoulder and viewing you like an audience. And that can be a good voice. It can be the voice of your conscience, but it can also be colonized and tricked, either by a team of Inception dream lads or just comments on Instagram.com.
So maybe men could be more accepting of other men regardless of their behaviors or opinions, because often it isn't masculinity you're defending. It's a hyper-exaggerated version of it that isn't benefiting anyone anymore. I wrote much of the script during a bit of late-night reflection as an idea that I just had to get out of my head. Since then, I've kept it on the back burner until now. Maybe in part because I thought that my individual opinion just wasn't compelling enough. So I opened the floor to other people who were either born male or who live as a male, and gave them the platform to share their experiences of masculinity. These are their stories.
Hey gang, it's Swole here. Just wanted to lay down some cis-het perspective on toxic masculinity. You know, growing up, I was very privileged to be surrounded by mostly very progressive minded people. But no one lives in a bubble, and whenever I did encounter toxic masculinity, it was a big turnoff, and it would make me question myself. Growing up, personally, I was never really interested in playing with dolls or dressing up like a girl, but my mom was. She wanted those things for me, and she tried them on, but in figure skating and gymnastics as well. I was never into any of those things, but, you know, if she had a boy that was, it's easy to see how toxic masculinity could harm a boy with even the slightest interest in any of those things. You know, now that I'm older, I hear stories of men, non-binary men, or even cis men, talking about growing up in environments with a lot of toxic masculinity, a lot of bullying from parents and friends, and this made them want to swear off masculinity in general because all it gave them was negativity. And I think a lot of boys struggle with this. And I think without any good role models, young men and boys have to navigate masculinity on their own and in their own way. And there's not much help out there to do it. I know that for me, floundering around as a young adult male and not really knowing who I was or my purpose, it wasn't until I started really embracing the more positive aspects of masculinity that I became much more comfortable with myself and started evolving as a person. For me, a lot of that was learning how to act in relation to women, being more confident, taking charge when needed, being a leader, being kind, generous, not getting jealous, but also learning to have appropriate boundaries, set them and don't let people cross them, and most importantly, not taking things personally, with women especially. You'll get real far in life if you just remember that one thing. Back on topic real quick, we want to make sure we're not invalidating the experience of any non-binary people, you know, saying that, oh, you're just choosing to be non-binary because you don't like the options that are given. That's not necessarily true. That's probably not true. But we do need to acknowledge that the negativity of toxic masculinity is enough to want to push people away from masculinity entirely, men and women. There are lots of women who swear off men entirely for this reason. And conversely, there are a lot of men who have had such bad experiences that they won't go near, you know, a sporting event, locker room banter. And I'm not talking Donald Trump locker room banter. You know, some healthy ribbing here or there, play fighting, roughhousing, UFC fighting, pro wrestling, powerlifting, bodybuilding, strongman competitions. We can appreciate all these things while being critical at the same time. Anyway, that's enough out of me. I hope some of that made sense. We're done here.
I was born male, and I lived as one until my late adolescence. Some people find out they were never the sex assigned to them, but I believe that I did used to be male, and, as I became an adult, I simply let go of the maleness I held as a youth. The most profound way that I felt hurt by a version of masculinity is in my lack of an emotional connection to my father figures. I have a biological father who lives far away and with whom I haven't spent much time, and a stepfather who raised me but who didn't know how to be sentimental with non-females. I want to be clear, my father figures care deeply about me, but we never truly bonded over anything. I don't fault them. My father has his own life and family, and my stepfather did all he could to make me a good citizen, but emotionality was never a part of our exchanges. That may, at least in part, explain why I don't feel the level of comfort from interactions with dudes that I feel from interactions with girls and others. I'm thankful that I wasn't subject to fully toxic behaviors, such as shaming or physical violence. But I'd be lying if I say that I didn't believe we could have shared more, or perhaps we'd feel less alone, if not for the archetype of the emotionless patriarch.
And is that trauma isn't always like a lightning bolt where you know that you've been hit. Sometimes trauma is like poison, that someone slips into your food in little doses and you sit down every night and you eat that poison and you don't realize that it's building up inside you until suddenly you stop functioning. There's a recognized phenomenon of cis men in particular who are often encouraged to be independent and strong, becoming dependent on their female partners, because what they really need is friends or a therapist. And that's obviously pretty emotionally draining for you girls, and pretty emotionally precarious for us guys.
Even men who actively chose to transition into the male gender can feel a bit out of place in how they represent traditionally masculine roles, because of toxic masculinity and its taint on the gender.
I'm firmly male, but personally do a lot of distancing myself from maleness. I have no desire to embody typical male gender roles. I feel restricted by the expectations placed upon me. There's so few positive masculine traits or roles, it's very hard to identify with them, or with maleness, despite my intrinsic feeling of maleness and gender dysphoria.
Many people chose to respond anonymously, often just wanting to talk rather than really knowing what they wanted to say. The thing they most often referenced was the inability to share their emotions and insecurities with peers.
My male friends and I generally don't discuss vulnerabilities or insecurities until after they prove themselves as problems, i.e. manifest themselves as poor behaviors, etc.
This may be the most dangerous aspect of toxic masculinity, because these poor behaviors could be self-harm, and since men tend to be more violent and therefore more effective in their suicide attempts, they often leave their friends and family saying, "I never saw it coming." Many researchers agree, quoting this tendency as a large causal factor in the relatively high male suicide rate, especially later in life. Additionally, I see others referencing the feeling of needing to be stoic about their physical health as well. Shit, I've been shot. Look, I'm just gonna walk it off. I'm a man, it'll be fine. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. I'm a man. I can tough it out. I can just man up, right? Just man up. I'll be fine. I'll be. And the danger this has put them in, especially with early detection being key in the treatment of many serious medical conditions.
Like I said, men are far less likely to seek help. We live in a society that looks down on men who ask for help. So maintaining that pride leads men to things like suicide, drug and alcohol addiction, and homelessness.
I feel like the idea of being a man as a gender has privileges that cause people to overlook the fact that masculinity, as a concept, is pretty bad for individuals when all effects are tallied. It encourages a lack of self-care, both mentally and physically. In fact, it sometimes feels like survived injuries are upheld as virtues for men. Manly men have scars. We are encouraged to talk up the glory and repress the pain and fear. It works out pretty well in our society too. The average working man is less likely to follow safety standards, less likely to consider the long-term harm of their actions just to get the job done quickly, less likely to complain because it's a competition and real men will struggle and fight to end up on top. It's a hard indoctrination to escape too. I still find myself prioritizing my goals over my body and mind, even though I know I shouldn't. If I were to pick one thing to change about masculinity, I would want the value of the male body and mind to be perceived and respected, so we as men could take better care of ourselves and others. We're not just bundles of flesh and bone, meant to bear all punishment with a grin.
Another respondent said that feelings of sexual inadequacy are a potent toxin to many men, a poison they internalize until it eats them from the inside. Virility seems to be an expected part of maleness.
I have personally felt feelings of sexual inadequacy that led me to reducing my emotional vulnerability until I basically cut it off entirely. I have made a point of bringing it up with at least 4 male friends of mine, who have all felt the same thing to some extent, and they have generally internalized it to the detriment of their own mental health and their relationships. The exact details vary. Sometimes it's premature ejaculation, or ability to maintain erection, or size, shape, etc.
So I asked him, why did he think that male identity was impacted so much by sexual performance? He told me he couldn't say, for sure, but part of his answer caught me off guard with its frank simplicity.
I know that sex is one of the basic functions of our bodies, like eating and breathing, and if you don't feel you're able to do it correctly, it's fundamentally unbearable.
Another man talked to me about the importance of us reaching out to men in pain, who are thinking that they need to suffer alone.
I think there's a whole subset of people who are hurting and looking for answers, but they feel too ashamed to be vulnerable, and they get caught up in shit like the red pill community because they don't know how to cope with it.
So that's why it's important not to let the really important warning signs of toxic masculinity get lost in reactionary fervor, because all kinds of men are hurting from this. And the best thing you might be able to do is to reach out, say hello, and make them feel comfortable as they are. Because I think that male culture has a long way to go in being welcoming of many different interpretations of masculinity, many of which might be more relevant and more necessary in the world as it is now than they have been previously. So maybe it's time to break out of some more traditional roles.
Since toxic masculinity is a set of behaviors and not a biological trait, the real men who participate are not really one-dimensional character archetypes like Biff, and they usually don't do all of the things on the list. Okay, well, sometimes they do, but usually that's not the case.
Alright, you know what to do by now. It's YouTube. Leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and check out the links in the description.